Welcome back to the Talk with Taylor podcast. I'm your host, Taylor, where we talk with anyone about anything, and hopefully everyone around the table will listen. I am so excited today to have Mr. Jason Romano on the podcast. He is a former producer at ESPN, and he spent several years there, and he has an incredible story, and I am so excited to have him on today. Mr. Jason, how are you doing?
Taylor, I'm great, man. So good to be on with you and your show. Thanks for having me.
Man, I am so pumped to have you. And man, we have some really great mutual connections. And
Yes.
man, I'm just finally glad to actually talk with you for a little bit. And so I know our listeners want to know this is, hey, Jason, tell us about your time at ESPN and what all you did.
Yeah. So it was, listen, it was a dream job.
Yeah.
I was there almost 17 years and I got to work on the radio side of things. I got to work on the television side. And then my last 4.5 years, I guess, was television, radio, but really social media. So I was on the cusp of the early days of the social media side of ESPN being born back in 2012. So I got to do a lot of cool things. I was so blessed to work there. I worked on a show called Mike and Mike in the Morning in its infancy as my very first job at ESPN. And then my very last job at ESPN was working back on Mike and Mike again in a
Wow.
much different role on a much bigger show.
Yeah.
And in between there, I got to work on the NFL project for almost 8 years, both with social media and as a talent producer, which is basically a booker. You book all the
Right.
guests. So I built a ton of relationships with a ton of different people, both at ESPN, but even outside of ESPN, and really understood the power of ESPN. If I'm being honest,
Yeah.
like if you call someone or you tell them you work for the ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut, even if you're nobody, which clearly I am,
Ah,
it was easy to at least get somebody to take your call.
right.
And through that helped build a lot of relationships for me. And like I said, both at ESPN and outside, that really would allow me to take that next step eventually and leave ESPN. But yeah, I loved what I got to do. Working on television was really difficult. In many times when there's breaking news, it's kind of a crazy environment to be around, but it was so awesome to go to work every day and say, look, we get to work, as so many said, in the toy department,
Yeah.
in terms of broadcasting at ESPN with sports. Like we are doing sports every day.
That's
And
right.
even though we took our jobs very seriously and you're working with people who are the best at what they do, we also understood that it was sports. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
there's moments where it transcends sports in a 9/11 type of setting,
Right.
but for the most part, it's just, talking about Aaron Rodgers, trying to lead the Packers to the Super Bowl
Yep.
or whatever.
Which people, that's a good point that you make. You get to talk sports, you get to be in
Yes.
the world of sports, and people, especially right now in the middle of COVID, we're just yearning for sports, right? When will
Including
sports?
myself. Yes.
Everyone, that's right. And so, and I don't think we realized how much we needed sports and how much we rely on sports in our culture. And so, talk a little bit to that about. You mentioned 9/11. I was thinking about that earlier. How
Yeah.
was that on set on a day like you said? Normal days, people go to escape politics, go to escape everything else in the world. But on a day
Yeah.
like 9/11, it transcends sports. So how was a day like 9/11 compared to just a normal day on ESPN?
Yeah, that day particularly was such a different type of day because at the time I was at ESPN for about a year, maybe 15 months or so, 14 months that I had been at ESPN. I mean, I was still living in my old apartment before we bought our first house, my wife and I. So that's how long ago it was. But I was working as a radio producer, and the show that I worked on was called Game Night with a guy named Chuck Wilson and Chris Moore, who were the radio hosts, and I was the sort of line producer, lead producer of the show. And September 10th, I worked, of course, and I worked nights.
Mm.
So I worked Monday through Friday at that point, and it was probably like a 2 to 11:30 shift. So I go in 2 in the afternoon, leave at 11:30, come home. Our show was on from 7 to 11, so 4 hours every night. It was a lot of fun. It was called Game Night for a reason. We were reacting to the games that were on. And the night before, the Giants played the Broncos on a Monday night football game in Denver, I believe.
Mm.
And I don't remember who won the game. My assumption would be the Giants, considering they were in the Super Bowl the year before, but I don't remember. But I do remember that at that time I was also a very big WWE fan. Now, it's not that I'm not anymore. I just don't watch it, so I don't really
Yeah.
know everybody who wrestles anymore. And I know the sport is big and the entertainment world is big. But at that time, that was when The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin and those guys were into it. And I was really into Raw, Monday Night Raw, but I couldn't watch it because I was working. So
Right.
I would record Monday Night Raw on the VCR,
Yeah.
Taylor, going
Yeah.
back to 2001. And then Monday or Tuesday morning, every single week, my wife would go to work and I would be home and I would wake up at, I don't know, 8 o'clock or so. I go down, get a bowl of cereal, and I would watch Raw.
Yeah.
So that's what I did Monday morning or Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001. I got downstairs, had, worked the night before, got a bowl of cereal, went down and watched Raw. At around 8:30 or 8:40 or so, I paused Raw to go to the bathroom or something. And when you used to pause on the VCR, and if it was more than 5 minutes or whatever, it would unpause and just stop
Yep.
your what you were watching. Well, that's what happened. And when you stop, the TV, whatever was on the TV, would come up.
Right.
Well, the TV that day was on the Today Show. My wife had watched it before she left, and I came back from whatever I went to do 10 minutes later, and I'm seeing, one of the towers are hit by a plane. And so I start watching. I'm curious, obviously, like everybody. And then I see the second plane go into the tower live. There's video of that all over YouTube if
Yeah.
people want to go back and watch. So I'm watching this, and I just spent the next 3.5 hours. I was very new in my faith, by the way, at that time. So I really wasn't comprehending like, prayer or anything like that at that
Yeah.
moment because I was so brand new in my walk. And I'm just sitting there on the couch for the next 3.5 hours watching everything that happened unfold. And I knew that I wouldn't normally go to work that day until 2 o'clock. And I called my wife and I was like, what's going on? She's like, no. I'm like, this is what's happening. And so she turns on a TV and then they send her friends, her colleagues home. And I call my boss and he's like, just come on in and we'll figure out what we're doing. And so I went into work and it was surreal. I mean, you really felt, I remember driving around. I lived in a little town called Plainville, Connecticut at the time. And I remember driving around Plainville on the day of 9/11 before I went to work and thinking, our world is never going to be the same again.
Right.
Like
Right.
what just happened?
Yeah.
America under attack. That was the headline on all the channels, right? That quickly, right after the towers. So I go to work and it's really surreal in the area that I'm in. I'm working at ESPN radio at the time. So I'm not really in the newsroom. I do know this, Taylor. All of our shows went dark around noon that day, I believe. And we just started carrying on ESPN's channels, radio and television, ABC News.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there was no point for us to try and, I mean, Mike and Mike were on the air when 9/11 hit, when it happened with the towers. But then quickly after Mike and Mike, I think I hope I'm right on this. I believe I'm right on this. We went to ABC News on the radio and on television.
Yeah.
And then the news directors started gathering and they decided they were going to do a 6 o'clock Sports Center for a half hour to just kind of talk about how 9/11 had affected the sports world that day.
Right.
And coming off of a game the night before. And so Trey Wingo and Bob Lee actually had hosted that show. And I'll tell you, I remember watching that. And I remember my bosses telling me, you don't have to worry about your show because it's not going to be on tonight. But tomorrow, September 12th, your show will return. The next day was really the hardest for me, Taylor, because I didn't know what the heck we were going to talk about.
Right.
On September 12th, 2001, on a sports talk show on ESPN that had no games to talk about.
Yeah.
What are we going to talk about?
Right.
And I remember we ended up getting whoever was available from the sports world to just let them express their reactions.
Right.
That's it. That's all you could do. Because they weren't going to go on ABC News and have like a head coach of a football team on.
Exactly.
So we called a head coach and just said, can you come on and talk, or an athlete or an analyst or a writer, anybody from the sports world. But you couldn't escape. That's the thing I remember most clearly was that, people, like you said, go to sports to escape from politics, to escape from news, to escape from sort of the real world. Right.
Yeah.
And those next 4 or 5 days, we couldn't escape it. We still had to talk about what was happening
That's
just
right.
with sports people.
Yeah.
And I remember it was Monday. I think the following Monday was the first sports event that restarted in baseball, maybe if I'm not mistaken. And it was just nice to have some sense of sports to
Yeah.
talk about, kind of like what happened in 2020, right? With the
Right.
pandemic, much different circumstances. But yeah, man, it was, I know that's a long-winded answer, but that was really what it was. It's probably the most surreal day I've ever worked. And it
Yeah.
was very early in my time at ESPN.
That's a great way to, just describe, you know, how you guys reacted, how people responded. It
Yeah,
transcended sports. And
it really
um,
did.
I spoke with earlier in the earlier podcast. I had an interview with Marcus Ogden and his brother, Hall of Fame guard or tackle, I think. And he was,
Jonathan Ogden.
yeah, Jonathan. Yep,
Yeah,
Jonathan.
of
Yep.
course.
And he was telling me about living in DC. So it's, I know it's nowhere near close to September, but this year will be the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So
I
it's
know, it's crazy.
it is. Well, crazy stuff. Well, man, we'll have to have another interview about some ESPN stuff, because I could ask you questions all day about
Of
that. But
course.
but
Yeah.
let's talk about the two books. So
Okay.
you wrote one back in 2017 or 16,
2017. Yeah.
and the title of that book is what now?
Live to Forgive.
So tell us a little bit about the heart of that book and the story behind it, and we'll talk about the latest one in just a moment.
Yeah. So that's my first book. I still chuckle when I say my first book because maybe this was how it was for you, Taylor, but I never wanted to write a book.
Yep.
I certainly didn't want to be an author.
Right.
I told you what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a broadcaster and work, producing radio and television and doing these things that, by God's grace, I was able to do at ESPN. But I never had any visions of writing anything. So this opportunity comes in 2016. Before I even signed with Core Media, who is the publisher. I had this idea about writing a book after I gave a sermon at my church, and the sermon was on forgiveness.
Mm.
And for the very first time, I shared about a story of me and my dad. And that's what the book Live to Forgive ended up being about. And I saw a bunch of people come up to me after I gave that sermon. And it was the first time I ever spoke, by the way, or gave a sermon at any church. And it was my home church here in Connecticut.
That's awesome.
And a few people came up to me and said, listen, thank you for doing that because you just told my story.
Mm.
I have a alcoholic father, or I have an issue forgiving my mom for doing this or my dad for doing that. And I guess I didn't realize that we all struggle
Yeah.
in this area. But the more people that came up to me, the more I realized I needed to continue to tell this story. Now, I didn't know how, I didn't know where, certainly didn't think I'd be writing a book. I also did not think that God would open up doors for me to speak or travel. That was not anything I ever pursued either. But that's what happened. And the more I kept sharing about forgiveness, the more I kept seeing more people need to hear about forgiveness. Like
Absolutely.
they struggle with it. And so in 2016, my friend Caleb, who's a pastor out in California, heard my sermon about forgiveness and said, we need to talk. And okay, what do you want to talk about? He's like, you need to write a book. And I said, nope, you're the author. He just wrote a book like a couple months earlier.
Yeah.
I said, no, you're the author. I'm not an author. I'm a producer. That's it. I'm an ESPN guy. I'm a sports guy. He's like, no, dude, you don't understand. Your story's too important not to write a book. Because if it helps one person, you need to tell it and you need to write it. And I said, well, who's going to read a book by me? My platform is whatever it is, but it's certainly not big or anything like that. And to the point where, like, I don't know, I was thinking like, 50,000 people are going to buy my book. No way. Who would have interest in that? But he kept reminding me, remember, you're not writing it for 50,000. You're writing it for one person.
That's right.
You're
That's
telling
right.
it, the story for one person. So I said, all right, well, how do you write a book? So he told me how he put his book together. We had a book proposal that we put together. And then I get a call from my friend, Steve Copeland, who's also your friend.
Yes.
And Steve Copeland and I had connected in 2012. And he's just awesome. He's one of my favorite people. He used to work for Sports Spectrum, which is now where I work.
Yep.
And so we connected in 2012. We reconnected in 2017. And I said to Steve, hey, I left ESPN, or 2016. So I was still at ESPN. I said, hey, Steve, I'm still at ESPN, but I'm thinking about maybe leaving. This idea for a book came about. Can we talk? So we talk. And he's all in. Like, he wants to help me because I asked him for help. Listen, I don't know how to write a book. but you do. You've written books for many people and you're really good at it.
That's right.
Would we ever consider partnering together? And so he said, I definitely want to write your story if you'd have me. And then he connected me with the publisher that I ended up signing with, Core Media and Robert Walker. And lo and behold, we had a contract signed in September and the book came out January 15th, 2018.
Wow.
And like I said, it's a book on forgiveness. It's a story, probably 60%, 70% narrative, my story of forgiving my alcoholic father. And it's about as real and as raw as you can get, Taylor. I mean, I tried to be as honest, I tried to be as open, and I got permission from my dad. I got permission from my family to do that because I didn't want to sugarcoat any of this.
Right.
But then there's 35% application.
That's great.
Because a lot of us can see stories and hear stories from other people, but how does that help them in their life?
That's right. How does it?
So Steve and I really wanted to make sure when we were writing this book to write it in a way that could both encourage someone with my story, but also help them apply those principles and some of the things. Everybody's story is different, obviously, but be able to just move forward, as the subtitle says, when someone they love hurts them. So that's Live to Forgive. You know, it's been out now 3 years. I know it's helped a lot of people.
Yes.
I'm sure it's the same way that your book has, Taylor, as it's helped so many people. And I've heard a lot of people come up to me and say, listen, I read your book, some of it. I can't finish it because I'm really going through a difficult time, but thank you for writing it. And that means the world. Like, that's really why I wrote it, because if some person, one person read it and it helped them learn to forgive someone else or drew them closer to God, it's worth its weight in gold, you know?
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And I think everyone that can hear the sound of our voices, if should definitely give that definitely check it out, because Paul talks about some of the things we should put on in Colossians chapter 3, and forgiveness is one of those things. And so I think that's a great book for anyone and everyone. And so the second book, like I said, a 2-time author. And so, like you said, you never thought you'd be an author, but now you got another book out, and The Uniform of Leadership. Now, I love leadership. I'm working on my PhD in strategic leadership as we speak. And so it's going to be a haul. It's going to take a while, but when I saw you had come out with this book, and I can't wait to bring you in to speak to our students in a couple of weeks. And so let's talk about The Uniform of Leadership, the idea behind this book, and how it came to be.
So Taylor, this book would have been the book if you'd have said to me 5 years ago, you're going to write a book someday, Jason. Now, first of all, again, I would have laughed at you, but I probably would have said, okay, if I had to write a book, it would have been at least some form of the book, The Uniform of Leadership. So that's the new book.
Yeah.
It released in July. And it's basically the stories, the experiences that I had at ESPN, but doing a little twist on it. So it's one thing for me to just tell stories, and people like to hear stories, and that's great. But I wanted it, again, to be a book that people could apply into their own lives.
Yes.
Right? It's one thing to hear stories. It's another thing to actually have something that somebody can help me put into place into my own journey. So that's what this book is. The Uniform of Leadership is a leadership book. Like you, I've been reading and devouring leadership books over the past decade or so.
Yeah.
People like John Gordon and people like Todd Gongwar, and certainly the GOAT, John, oh gosh, what's his name now? John, you edit this, by the way?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm not that good at editing. I'm not a producer like you. So John something.
You can send the audio to me and I'll edit. You ready?
Okay, good.
The GOAT, John Maxwell. I mean,
John Maxwell. Yes.
Of course.
Yes,
so all of these gurus in the leadership world, and I was reading all of their books and just really enjoying the idea of what it means to be a servant leader. And it helped me through the last 5 years, I would say, at ESPN to understand my purpose there.
Yep.
So this book comes along, you know, when you write the first book, and maybe you've had this too, people come up and say, well, when you're writing the second book, and it's like, can I just get through the first book?
That's right.
But we went through the first book, and you know, Steve and I had such a great experience working together that I just kind of said, you know what, Steve, why don't we talk out an idea for a second book and see if this is something that you're interested in? And so we did. He was interested, and we had this idea called Tales from the ESPN Car Wash.
Ooh.
The ESPN Car Wash is not a car wash, but it's when a guest, you know, an athlete or an entertainer come to ESPN studios and go on all the different shows.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
call it the ESPN Car Wash. So the idea was that's what I did for 9 years. Let me tell the stories of the athletes and the coaches and the entertainers that I spent time with and include that as this book. And so that's what we kind of marketed it as.
Mhm.
It was still going to be lessons as well, like a leadership lesson type book. But then once we went through the process of shopping it around, by the way, it got rejected by 15 publishers
Wow.
in the summer of 2018,
Mm.
in the fall of 2018. So I really thought God didn't want this to be written.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, okay, I'm not going to spend a ton of money on this, and I'm not going to
Right.
spend a ton of effort if nobody's interested.
Right. Right.
I did believe in the stories,
Yeah.
but then Kriegel came along, Kriegel
Mhm.
Publishing, and that's who we signed with. And they made an offer and just wanted to invest in the book.
That's great.
What I mean by investing, they wanted to make it a hardcover. They wanted to
Mhm.
make it, it's a really nice looking, feeling book when you get your copy. And it's got pictures in the middle and everything. I mean, they invested into it, but they also believed in the idea of leadership. So
Right.
they came up with the title after we submitted the first manuscript for the Uniform of Leadership. They came back to us and said, what do you think of this title? And then Steve and I, my co-author, we went back and said, what exactly does the uniform of leadership mean? And what does it represent?
Mhm.
So in a nutshell, Taylor, if you're putting on a uniform every single day when you wake up, right? You're representing something. You're representing yourself. I'm representing Jason every single day when I wake up. So I'm putting on that uniform of Jason.
Yep.
I have to make a decision. Who am I playing for first when I wear that uniform?
That's
Am
right.
I playing for myself first? Am I playing for others first? Or am I playing for God first?
Right.
Now, for those that may be listening that aren't super spiritual or Christian, you always should be playing for others first. That's where
Absolutely.
you really thrive as a leader. Now, I always say if you're a person of faith listening, play for God first. That's
Right.
who you're reporting to. That's who, your CEO, that's who our king is, right? But after that, it's God first, others second,
Yep.
and then ourselves third. So it's not like we're taking ourselves out of the equation, but order is important. And so wearing the uniform of leadership properly is when you have others first
Mm.
on the front of your jersey, and
That's
then
right.
your name on the back of the jersey is below that.
Mm.
The best leaders serve. The
That's right.
greatest leader is Jesus. If you read Matthew 20:28, he says, I did not come to be served, but to serve
That's right.
and give my life as a ransom for many. That's Jesus, the greatest leader ever, saying that I came to serve.
Yep.
So if he's saying he came to serve, then who am I to think that I didn't come to serve? Like that's who I want to represent in my life. And certainly as a leader, I've seen the great leaders, even those that maybe aren't Christ followers that are just in positions of leadership. The great leaders always love and serve and care for the people around them and put others first.
Mm.
That's
That's
the
it.
uniform of leadership.
Absolutely. And hey, and leadership starts at the feet of Jesus. That's
Yes.
comes from a student leadership university, and the whole mindset behind that is getting off the throne of your own life and allowing Jesus to sit on the throne. And it starts
Yes.
with a servant's heart. And man, I can't wait to dive into the book, and can't wait for our students to read it and hear from you. And Jason, man, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Mm-hmm.
And man, if there's anything that our culture loves, it loves sports. And I love that you've used your platform, used your story to impact those for the kingdom. And Jason, man, thank you so much for being on. Is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with before you go?
I mean, just I'll encourage them to really, because I think it's weirdly enough in this society that we live in, I think we're in a crisis a little bit for both forgiveness and leadership.
Yeah.
And so I think, that Live to Forgive title, I was so struck by it because I still think that that's the single clearest way to freedom
Mm.
is to forgive, freedom
Amen.
for ourselves.
Amen.
And,
What does
the
Carrie
uniform
Fisher
of,
say? She says,
yeah,
uh, jealousy uh, or holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
I
You know.
just said this the other day at my church.
Yep. Yep.
When you choose not to forgive, it's like drinking poison, expecting somebody else to die.
Yep.
And that's an unbelievable statement because it's so true. When
It
we
is.
don't forgive someone, when we harbor bitterness inside of us,
Mm.
we're the ones that suffer, not the
That's right.
person who we're trying to hold the bitterness
Yeah.
from. For the
Yep.
most part, they've probably moved on with their life,
Right.
and we're the ones. So I would leave people with that, and I would also leave them with, an evaluation of their own leadership. Because
Mm.
I had a lot of people come up to me, Taylor, and say, "Listen, I'm not a leader, Jason. And I said, maybe by title for your job, you're not a leader. But when you wake up every day, do you have a family that you live
Mm,
with? And that are you a
good.
mom or a dad? Yes. Well, then you're a leader. It
Yes,
starts
yes.
in the home. It's not
As
a
the
kid.
family goes, so goes the nation.
Ain't that the truth? And it
Yep.
starts with me as a dad and as a husband in my house. And if I'm going to have a servant's heart, that has to start with them before I even think about going out into the world to serve.
That's right.
And so you are a leader. Everybody listening is a leader. Everybody's a leader on some form, in some way. And start with leading by loving others and
Mm.
serving others.
That's right. Well, Jason, thank you so much. Everyone listening, the video is going to be on YouTube. You can purchase Jason's book. We'll have links to the Uniform of Leadership and Live to Forgive all in the description, the bio. And Jason, thank you so much for being on today. And thank you so much for listening to the Talking with Taylor podcast.